Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
America is the country that started the AI race. And as President of the United States, I'm here today to declare that America is going to win it.
I'm Stephanie Flanders, Head of Government and Economics at Bloomberg, and this is Trumponomics, the podcast that looks at the economic world of Donald Trump, how he's already shaped the global economy, what on earth is going to happen next. One thing President Biden and President Trump and any other elected US politician can agree on is America needs to win the race for AI supremacy. You just heard Donald Trump say as much at the administration's recent AI summit, and he went on to vow to do everything it takes to achieve that. So we're asking a simple question. How's he doing? At that summit, he unveiled a 23-page AI action plan, which to one expert read like an industrial-scale mobilization order. The emphasis was all on freeing up companies to move fast and innovate, getting rid of the red tape in the way of building data storage centers, junking Biden-era guardrails on safety, and pretty much everything that might be standing in the way of big AI companies doing what they want to do. So will it work? And if so, at what potential cost? Well, naturally, we have two brilliant Bloomberg voices to tell us the answer and to consider whether other Trump policies that we often discuss on this podcast might be working against the administration's goals on AI. With me in the London studio is Parmy Olson, a Bloomberg Opinion columnist covering technology. She's a former reporter for the Wall Street Journal and Forbes, and the author most recently of Supremacy, AI, ChatGPT, and the Race That Will Change the World. That's the book that won the Financial Times Business Book of the Year award in 2024. Parmy, so great to have you on.
Thank you for having me.
I think the last time I saw you may have been at the award ceremony itself.
Yes, that was nice.
Very pleasant surprise for you to win. And in Washington D.C, Michael Deng joins us. Michael's the geoeconomics technology analyst for Bloomberg Economics, and he previously served in the Biden administration as a policy advisor and presidential management fellow in the CHIPS program office at the Department of Commerce, among other things. Michael, welcome to Trumponomics, your first time too.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Parmy, since you have just written this book and we have heard a lot about DeepSeek in the last 6 months or so, if the president wants the US to win the race in AI, is the US still the leader in this technology, or did DeepSeek show us that China had already caught up?
Well, it depends how you define leader. But I would say when it comes to AI capabilities, the models and how good they are at reasoning and math and coding, then yes, US models are still ahead of the ones coming out of China. The thing is, they're not ahead by much. It's a very narrow lead. Now, when it comes to actual adoption of AI services, I would say that in China, it's much more sort of readily available. People use AI much more in their daily lives. And China's ability also to kind of create the energy infrastructure they need to build AI models, they're able to kind of spin up the gigawatts that they need. I think it's something like 400 gigawatts that they're already planning for AI that they have available versus, dozens of gigawatts that the US has. That certainly puts them in a very advantageous position. But as it stands, the US is still ahead. DeepSeek, of course, caused this kind of freak out moment for Silicon Valley back in January when that dropped, because here was a model that was not only as good as ChatGPT, but it was free. And the blueprints had been put on the internet for anybody to copy and develop on, which is absolutely what people have done. And that really spoke to why China's tech sector has moved so quickly, is there's been this real focus on open source or so-called open weight models. When you keep your tech proprietary and secret, you kind of have to start from scratch as a company each time you build AI. But if it's open, companies are collaborating more with each other and they're building on top of one another's innovations. And then collectively, the whole industry can just move a lot more quickly. And that's exactly what's happened in China. But as I say, they haven't completely caught up, but they're close.
Okay, so Michael, we heard at the beginning there at the summit that Donald Trump at least thought his action plan was all about maintaining US leadership and winning that race. What does this administration think is the answer on this?
Yeah, so I think the AI action plan is interesting in that it does correctly identify some of the key areas in which the U.S. really needs to develop further and is falling behind on China if it wants to keep up and win this AI race. One of the areas that it really clearly highlights is in power infrastructure. Parmy has already mentioned that China's being able to build on the hundreds of gigawatt scale and is bringing on much more power than the U.S. is capable of bringing on to be able to match the demand that data centers will require. And this action plan specifically accelerates a lot of the permitting processes required to build these data centers. Though interestingly, it doesn't outright call for building new infrastructure. A lot of it is mainly about accelerating interconnection, optimizing grids, stabilizing grids, et cetera. But it's still headed in the right direction. The contradiction there, however, is that, last year, 90% of new power generation capacity added to the U.S. came from renewables. And the Big Beautiful Bill explicitly rolled back a lot of the clean energy tax credits that was going to support that sector of the economy. And another wrinkle in the AI action plan itself is that the aversion to solar and wind is still very clear in the text there. You'll notice that they highlight nuclear fission, geothermal, and fusion as the only new sources of energy they think should be developed further, while excluding solar, wind, clean battery storage, et cetera. So it doesn't really make sense, especially mentioning fusion, which is, not close to being technically viable at this point. On workforce itself, it does target a longstanding gap in the U.S. ecosystem in that it's trying to build up that vocational workforce to operate and deploy AI. The issue there being, however, that, a lot of President Trump's recent actions in the past few months have targeted that high-end research talent pipeline that's really critical for advancing the frontier of AI research. Universities, government funding, and also immigration. Jensen Huang has said something of, 50% of all AI researchers are Chinese. So while you're building up the vocational workforce, you're undercutting or undermining the elite research workforce you need to really advance that frontier. And so, again, a mixed bag on what it's actually doing. And the last thing I'll bring up is export controls, which is a massive topic, lots of implications for foreign policy, how President Trump has acted so far in the past 6 months towards partners. Tariffs are involved as well. So very big topic.
Right. Well, you have introduced the idea that there might be some tensions within the plan, but certainly between the plan announced at the summit and other aspects of Donald Trump's policies. And we are going to get into that. But Parmy, you described this as a gift to big tech. We know that the people involved in this seem to have played a central role in devising this plan. Your book is all about the people behind AI. I suspect that you have some insight into them as well.
Oh, that's always the most interesting part. I think one of the most important people behind this plan is Jensen Huang, who is the CEO of NVIDIA. And Jensen, you see him on stage walking around with this leather jacket. He is not someone who likes doing lobbying in Washington, D.C., but he's had to do that in the last few months after the Trump administration came into power. And first of all, back in April, the White House enacted a ban on NVIDIA's chip sales to China. That's a huge problem for NVIDIA because it said it would cost $15 billion in revenue. And so there came now this effort from Huang to try and turn that view around. And he kind of found an ally in the Trump administration in David Sachs, who is the so-called crypto and AI czar. And both of them were really pushing this idea that actually we need to continue selling to China. Because if we don't, China's and Huawei are going to build their own chips, and then they're going to build their own AI services on top of that. And guess what? They're going to sell all that AI technology to other countries around the world, and they're going to be the world's leading AI provider. What we need to do is kind of clutter the market in China with our own tech, with NVIDIA chips, so that Chinese companies become reliant on our own infrastructure. And it's really interesting that this is actually fundamentally a very Silicon Valley worldview. This idea that if you kind of blitz scale your product or service, dominate the market, eventually consumers, businesses, your customers get locked into your ecosystem. And we've all kind of experienced that with Apple iPhones and Microsoft, cloud, the hyperscalers, cloud services. It's actually hard for their customers. They feel they're locked in. And so this was the idea that Huang and Sachs really pushed in the Trump administration. Eventually, Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, also picked up on that. And we saw that play out with this big U-turn that Trump made on the ban on NVIDIA chips. He lifted it. So NVIDIA is now able to continue selling specialized sort of export-controlled chips called the H20s. they're kind of framed as being low power, not as good as the ones that American companies can use, but actually they're still pretty powerful, and Chinese companies can still do a lot with them. And so I think that's raised a lot of questions in Washington among kind of traditional China hawks in the administration about, is this really a good idea?
And I think, Michael, you've described this as a strategic pivot from technology denial to export dominance. This idea that instead of trying to keep China from getting the technology, you make everybody, the whole world, including China, absolutely dependent on it. I mean, that seems to me a major shift, not just from policy a few months ago, but actually from the Biden administration's kind of instincts on this of actually trying to put controls on technology. But I know that there's different levels of export control involved here. So just talk me through it a bit, Michael. Is this a complete change of strategy, or is it a bit murkier than that?
Absolutely. I would characterize it as very murky in the sense that if you notice in the AI action plan itself, there's a section specifically for export controls. And that section almost looks like it was written by the same Biden administration export control specialists and thinkers.
That you used to work alongside.
Exactly. In that one, it hints and signals at targeting component subsystems of semiconductor tools. And what that means is, if you think about the progression of export controls over the past few years, we essentially went from controlling the chips, then to controlling the tools, and now the administration is thinking about controlling the components that go into those tools. So again, with those components, there's a heavy reliance on the U.S. and Western suppliers. So it is an avenue of vulnerability for China in terms of building up their domestic semiconductor manufacturing ecosystem. But this has been a direction that export controls have been going into for a while, and those in the field have been seeing if this was going to happen. But it really does seem to be at odds with letting H20 chips go to China. And now I can see maybe like a targeted strategy of we'll deny them access to building up their own manufacturing ecosystem while still letting them have access to chips so a Huawei competitor doesn't build up. But on the flip side, what it now means is you've enabled the entire Chinese AI ecosystem to build off of that. And if you notice what Anthropic and OpenAI have said, they've always been fairly pro-export control. Anthropic in particular has gotten into it publicly with NVIDIA sometimes around export controls, because they understand that if you give H20s and advanced compute to China, you're empowering their AI companies to become more competitive and to compete directly with DeepSeek, with Alibaba, with US AI companies.
So, Parmy, I would imagine other parts of the sort of AI ecosystem are a bit concerned, I guess, on two fronts, that there's this quite abrupt change of strategy from the US, and also that it is in itself a bit inconsistent and seemingly unstable. We often talk about in Trumponomics about the sort of uncertainty being costly for trade and for the real economy, but I imagine it's, if anything, more costly if you're trying to think about AI investments.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, you said inconsistent and seemingly unstable. I feel like that should be the tagline for the Trump administration. And that's precisely like, as Michael was saying, when you read the action plan, the actual behavior of Trump doesn't correspond to what is being said in this plan. Tough talk on export controls, and yet he has
given in on the most important one, or the biggest, most obvious one.
Arguably the most important one. Yeah, I think this kind of uncertainty is perhaps not great for companies. But on the other hand, in Silicon Valley, there's this term accelerationist. So if you're an AI accelerationist, you want to move fast and break things. Essentially, you believe that AI development should speed up because the benefits to humanity will outweigh whatever risks and problems come up along the way. And what seems to be happening is the White House is adopting this accelerationist approach that has taken hold in Silicon Valley. Just even a year and a half ago, so-called AI doomers were lobbying very hard in Washington for more guardrails out of concern that AI could bring existential risk to human civilization. Those voices are now completely quiet. They've been drowned out by the accelerationists. So yes, while the uncertainty isn't great, I think for tech companies, AMD is another one in Silicon Valley, anyone making hardware, anyone selling to China, this is really good news.
Michael, I do want to go back to you on how some of this sits within a broader economic policies, broader Trumponomics that we've seen over the last few months. And you referenced some of it at the beginning. Just talk me through how important the negatives have been so far on the issues that really matter to the development of AI, and how that might sort of stack up against anything that was said at the summit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the biggest issue with a lot of this is the AI action plan lays out very ambitious objectives and correctly diagnoses the areas on which the U.S. needs to work. But the environment and the ecosystem currently that the Trump administration has created with many of their policies is not conducive to running as fast as possible on AI. I've talked about the workforce issues already. I've talked about the energy issues already. But even if we're speaking about globally, for example, on export controls, you need close collaboration with a lot of these suppliers in other countries to be able to set up a regime that actually keeps China out of these key technology choke points. And the AI action plan itself has some very coercive and muscular language in essentially saying that we welcome allies to collaborate with us. And if not, we're going to use secondary tariffs, the foreign direct product rule, to induce allies to participate in this export control regime. And so that was something that really surprised me when I read it. It wasn't something that the Biden administration, when I was there, ever seriously considered. Though when negotiations got tough, it came close a few times, I will say. It essentially shows this Trump administration's view that they can force U.S. tech supremacy on the rest of the world. They're going to do that through the export packages that they've contemplated, despite the fact that this is, at the end of the day, a very global industry, a very global ecosystem. And so it's very unclear to me how exactly they're going to make the U.S. outrun China on this AI supremacy race if they're going to be so unilateral in their approach.
Just a small footnote to that, and you've made the point in other analysis that you've done, if you're also making the US itself a more closed economy, it's going to be this sort of inside the fortress America, you're going to build all this stuff and that's going to sustain the supremacy, but you're making it harder for those crucial inputs. I remember, Michael, you highlighted just that copper tariff. Just remind us that even that one piece is going to make things harder for a certain bit of the chips industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Donald Trump in this AI action plan talks about building out AI infrastructure, data centers, semiconductor fabs. All of those require a lot of inputs from abroad, imported. Data centers use immense amounts of copper in power and cooling. Semiconductor fabs, even more so, not copper just for power and cooling, but copper is found in chips themselves. And not just to talk about copper, we were contemplating Section 232 sectoral tariffs on semiconductors, and those might involve semiconductor tools themselves, all the different consumables and materials that will go into these fabs being built in the US that they need to actually produce the chips that go into AI. At the end of the day, chip manufacturing and AI data centers require a lot of global inputs that just doesn't square with this vision of a fortress America, this unilateral vision that Trump is all in for.
Parmy, I mean, you weren't at the summit, though I imagine that you had your spies there in one form or another.
Yeah.
Was any of these sort of tensions, apparent contradictions voiced there? I mean, even the sort of basic fact that all that he's talking about building this stuff and getting rid of red tape and all the bureaucracy at the same time as actually the imported components that you really need to make this stuff is becoming more and more expensive and harder to get. Was there anybody who was saying, hang on a minute?
Not that I could see. I mean, I was checking out a lot of social media. There's a website called TechMeme that aggregates all the chatter about any particular topic. And everything that was going on Twitter was pretty much praising the bill. And I mean, that's just a kind of cacophony of voices from Silicon Valley are just happy to see things moving ahead so quickly, because the whole plan covers so many different things. So it's kind of hard to look deep into the weeds, as Michael has noted all these very important contradictions. And so my sense is that actually people aren't taking much note of those potential limitations.
And is it just because they're so lofty and big picture that they don't really think about how do you actually build any of these things?
They're not lofty, they're galactic. I mean, the people in Silicon Valley they're living in the future. And that's kind of what makes the region so successful, is they don't see themselves constrained by traditional limits that might limit people and entrepreneurs in other parts of the world. There's just this incredible amount of belief that has helped propel so many of these businesses, not alongside anti-competitive practices, of course, as they get bigger.
I mean, historically, people animated by just a vision of the future, it hasn't always gone well, but I'll leave that aside.
Oh, absolutely.
But just to come back on this safety point, and I just noted, I mean, there's lots of people who are writing about it, but Azim Azhar, who's the British kind of blogger and tech entrepreneur who writes often about these issues, he had a sort of quite nice line. He said, the upside of all this is speed. The downside, mainly for the rest of the world, is a regulatory vacuum primed for social, environmental, and geopolitical blowback. Do you think that's right, Parmy?
Oh, 100%. But I think at the same time, even in a place like Europe, where we have the European Union's AI Act, that still has a lot of problems. The act in itself is incredibly vague. It's got loopholes. I think, just very briefly, one of the biggest problems we're seeing today with AI is addiction to AI companions, people forming emotional bonds with them, getting emotionally manipulated, some people experiencing psychosis. There have been many, many stories about people getting ChatGPT-induced psychosis.
No, you wrote a very good... I recommend everybody your column about it, which made me think about it. But it was also, even for people who don't get psychotic episodes, you lose your critical thinking capacity.
But that's because these models are kind of, in much the same way social media was, optimized for engagement to keep you talking. And so many of them, and ChatGPT in particular, tend to validate the user. And so you have these unintended consequences that it would have been impossible to predict a year ago even. And so writing regulation is really like chasing a bullet. And so, yes, we're in a regulatory vacuum, made worse by the fact now that these companies are moving so quickly and deploying so quickly. And we really, that's why I think the UK really needs to step up its own regulatory efforts here, because I think the UK is a great tech regulator.
Well, I know that there were some of these basic issues they've really struggled with, including AI safety. So I wouldn't hold your breath, but maybe. Michael, there's one thing I wanted to mention that we haven't touched on, and then we're going to run out of time. We've said all the way through the trade-off that's been made with this action plan is over sort of speed over safety, and the junking of the sort of a lot of the guardrails around ethics and AI safety that President Biden had at least tried to begin to develop. But there's one area where they are still focused on safety. They want to keep us safe from being forced to think about climate change and from the woke mind virus. So just talk us through that, because there's a lot in here which is actually about getting that out of AI.
Yeah, so I remember reading that section and trying to understand how exactly they were going to implement it. And the executive order also just came out that still doesn't go into much detail about it. I think this fundamentally is entirely a political move to, highlight a issue that I think within AI is not a major area of concern.
Parmy, I guess just to give you the last word, and I may be mischaracterizing, but one of the columns that you wrote, I think immediately after DeepSeek came out or soon afterwards, and you're sort of reflecting on how significant that was and changing our view of how the AI race might turn out. And you suggested that actually the AI not being US dominated and being more open source, or at least open weight, might be healthier for the world. Do you still think that? I guess there's a risk that, China could have won. It might be China dominated.
Yeah. And I think I don't agree with the kind of state-controlled aspect of Chinese AI. But I think the best thing about DeepSeek was that it raised the specter of more competition. And it raised this notion that maybe the Western Silicon Valley companies weren't the guaranteed winners of this AI race. Here were these other companies coming out of China that were cheaper, that were free, and that were just as good. This isn't really an issue about American companies. This is more about companies that dominate the market, as we've seen already with cloud companies from Silicon Valley, e-commerce companies. It's almost impossible now to open an e-commerce business because of Amazon. And so many parts of the wider market have absolutely been warped by the anti-competitive and monopolistic behavior of big tech. And what would be terrible would to just see that continue with AI. And AI being so transformative, so emotionally powerful, cognitively powerful, it can influence how people think about things. People are using it to make daily life decisions and write their own emails and reports. That leaves an incredible amount of power in the hands of just a few companies who are building these models. And so if there are more on the market, I think that's a great thing. I think there needs to be more competition. Whether that will actually continue to play out, as it's still playing out now, I think is an open question.
Well, it's still playing out. There's some very wise words from both of you, some of which I suspect the president would think were bordering on treacherous.
Oh dear.
The prospect of, non-American leadership. But thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Trumponomics from Bloomberg. It was hosted by me, Stephanie Flanders, and I was joined by Bloomberg's Parmy Olson and Michael Deng. Trumponomics is produced by Summer Sadi and Moses Andam, with help from Amy Keane. And special thanks this week to Nervi Shavin. Sound design is by Blake Maples, and Sage Bowman is the head of Bloomberg Podcasts. Please help others find it and enjoy it by rating and reviewing Trumponomics wherever you listened.